In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to move around inside the viewport for Cinema 4D. Alright, so when you launch Cinema 4D for the first time, you'll be presented with an interface and a workspace that looks like this. Now, during this overview section of our training, we're going to spend the next probably 12 or so lessons really just talking about a lot of the major elements of Cinema 4D as far as how you work within the application, a lot of these major editors, and a few really important concepts that will really factor into just about everything that you do in Cinema 4D from this point forward. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the process of moving around inside this 3D workspace. Now, to see this a little bit easier, let's drop in maybe just a couple of really primitive objects. That way we can actually see what it is that we are doing as far as camera movement. So to create a primitive object, we're going to go to this top menu bar. We're going to click on this little blue cube. We're going to click and hold. And let's drop in something like this simple torus. Okay, so to move around this object, that's done by pressing and holding the Alt key on your keyboard. And then we can use our left, middle, and right mouse buttons. So if we Alt left click, that will rotate this camera around our object. If we Alt middle click, that will move this camera from side to side, as well as up and down. And if we Alt right click, that will dolly this camera in and out. So that's the process of working if you're using a 3-button mouse. And that is the workflow or the setup that I currently have. Now, if you're working on a system that maybe does not have a 3-button mouse, there is an alternative workflow inside of Cinema 4D. So an alternative is you can press and hold the 1 key on your keyboard. And if you press and hold the 1 key while now left-clicking with your mouse, that will sort of move this camera around, again, side to side, up and down. If you press and hold the 2 key on your keyboard and left-click, that will dolly you in and out. And if you press and hold the 3 key and left-click, that will rotate the camera. Okay, so a couple of different workflows that you can take advantage of. As an alternative, you also have the ability to use these little icons up here. So if you click and drag with your left mouse button up here, you can move. If you click and drag with your left mouse button, you can dolly in and out. And if you click and hold with your left mouse button, you can rotate around. Alright, now next to this we also have an icon which will shift us from a single view to a 4-panel view. Now you'll notice that you can see these icons in all of our different views. So right now we have our perspective view, and then we have 3 what are called orthographic views. So here we have the right, we have the front, and we have the top. Sort of think of these as a little bit more of a schematic. So here we have the 3D representation of our object, and in here we see almost sort of like the flattened blueprints of the same object. Now in any of these viewports you can see we have the same little navigation icons up here. We can click on this button and maximize any of our viewports. We can also, as an alternative workflow, if you have a 3-button mouse, an easier way of getting through these is to just simply middle click anywhere in your viewport, and by just simply clicking with my middle mouse button, that'll bounce us to this 4-panel view. If I move my mouse into any of these other viewports, let's say my top viewport, and middle click, you can see now my top viewport becomes active. So again, a couple different ways of moving around and bouncing around between your viewports. Now, in addition to just simply jumping back and forth between this single panel and a 4-panel view, Cinema 4D actually does give us a lot of different alternative layouts. So if we go to Panel, down to Arrangement, you can see we actually have quite a few to choose from. So if we go to maybe this 3 views bottom split, click on that, you can see now we have our perspective up top, and now we have our top view and a right view. So lots of different options to choose from. We can maybe do a 4-view. Now we have a perspective view up here, and now we have top, right, and front. Okay, so again, lots and lots of different options for us to choose from. In my case, I'm just going to stick with this standard 4-panel view. Now, let's talk for a minute about the process of framing an object or a selection. So to demonstrate this, let's go back up to our little primitive objects here. Let's click and hold, and let's drop in maybe a pyramid. Okay, now with this pyramid, Let's just grab this manipulator and move this over to the side. And now we have a couple of different objects in our scene. So as I move my camera around, again, I'm using Alt and left click to rotate my camera. You can see that we're really sort of moving around this central area, kind of between these two objects. So if we grab an object, and let's say we want to shift our focus or quickly move the camera onto just this one object. Well, there's a couple of different ways of doing that inside of Cinema 4D. One is to go back to our cameras, and we're going to go over to View, and we could either frame all, frame geometry, or frame default. So in this case, let's click on this frame geometry. Now in this case, it pretty much centers up everything in the scene. Because we only have geometry in the scene at the moment, we don't have any lights or any other animation objects. So right now, Cinema 4D will center my camera on the geometry. Now what we can also do is frame selected objects. So if I click on this, you can see that will move my camera and center this selected object right in the middle of my viewport. If I go over here and select my pyramid, once again, View, Frame Selected Objects. Now this little pyramid has been moved to the center of my camera. Now we can do this with a keyboard shortcut. So if I select any of my objects, I can quickly tap the O key on my keyboard. So O, and now that object has been moved to the center of my camera. Again, grab an object, quickly press the O key, and there we go. Now, once again, if maybe I wanted to get everything in my viewport, let's say I wanted to get everything sort of nice and centered in here, again, just go to View, and we can go to Frame All. Now it'll take everything in my scene and try to center it as closely as possible into my viewport. Okay, now one last thing that I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson is the ability to change how our camera is rotating around our objects. So right now, if I press and hold the Alt key on my keyboard and left click, you can see that my object, or my camera, is sort of rotating around this random point in space. Now if I select one of my objects, and again tap the O key on my keyboard, it sort of is rotating around this random point. Now if I come in and tap the S key on my keyboard, again, we can come in here and frame up these objects. So we could use either the O or the S key, and both have a very similar effect. But what you'll notice is if I sort of Alt and then left click out in this open empty space, this little cursor that shows up, this little crosshair, this little white crosshair in the middle of my viewport, that's really sort of our point of rotation. So think of that as the center around which this virtual camera is rotating. You can see right now it's sort of in this open part of empty space. Now, if I Alt and left click and drag while I have my cursor over an object, you can see in this case, now this virtual center will actually snap to my object. So if I move my cursor over to this little pyramid and then Alt left click, you can see now my virtual camera is rotating around that little white crosshair. But again, Alt left click out in open empty space, and it just sort of rotates around a random point. Okay, so a couple of different behaviors that we're getting here. Now we do have the option of actually changing this behavior inside of Cinema 4D. So if we go up to Cameras and down to Navigation, we have a few options to choose from. Now what I'm going to do is click on this little dotted line that's right above my menu, so I can rip that off. So by default we have this set to a cursor mode. Now we can also set this to a center mode, and when we turn on the center mode, now what you can see is if I Alt left click and drag, even when I'm over a piece of geometry, it will always leave my sort of virtual center out in this open empty space. So if you prefer that sort of behavior, you do have that option. We also have this object mode. Now if I turn on object mode, you can see now, regardless of where I Alt click and drag, my virtual camera will always move around the center of my selected object. So if I go over here and select my pyramid, and now Alt click and drag, even though my cursor is out here in open space, you can see my camera stays centered around my selected object. Okay, and then finally we have what's called a camera mode. So instead of the camera sort of orbiting around a virtual point in space, think of this camera as now sort of moving on a tripod. So the camera itself sort of stays stationary, but now it's just sort of pointing and aiming at a different direction. Whereas with all of these other modes, we're actually picking the camera up and swinging the camera around through space. So a few different options, again, that you have to choose from here. So as a matter of personal preference, I usually like to leave this set to a cursor mode, so that way I do have that option of just a little bit more control. Okay, now one last thing that we do have is we can sort of quickly toggle between a couple of these. So if I have this set to cursor mode, I can Alt, click and drag. And again, you can see as long as I Alt, click and drag on a piece of geometry, that little virtual center will move along with it. But let's say maybe I wanted at some point to quickly switch to the ability to orbit around this object over here. Well, I could Alt, left click and drag over that object, but what if I'm in the middle of dragging and then I realize at this point I'm not actually moving where I want to? Well, what I could do is if I start to Alt, click and drag, if I press and hold Alt and Control, you can see that will quickly snap to this new rotation mode. So if I Control Alt and then left click and drag, it will temporarily switch me over to this mode where I am orbiting around my selected object. So again, really neat ability here, and lots of control that Cinema 4D does give you. So that's just a quick look at how we can start to move around inside of Cinema 4D's virtual workspace. So in the next lesson, we'll start to talk about some of the different display modes and a few other customization options that relate to the way that Cinema 4D will display your objects.